They lived without noise, without clocks, without questions. Inside cold stone walls beneath wooden beams, monks followed the same silent rhythm for centuries. From dawn's first bell to the hush of midnight prayer, their lives were measured not in words, but in movement, ritual, and stillness. They worked, they read, they ate, all without speaking. And somehow, in that long silence, they found meaning. Dim the lights, settle in, and join us as we explore how medieval monks lived, labored, and rested in a world almost entirely without words. The architecture of silence, cloisters, corridors, and soundless stone. In the early light of an English morning, around the year 1235, a Cistercian monk would rise slowly from his straw-stuffed mattress in the communal dormitory. His sandals, worn smooth by repetition, would move with minimal sound across the cold flagstone floor. There would be no words, not from his lips, nor from those nearby. The rule of Saint Benedict, first composed in the 6th century, had long governed their lives, and among its many principles, silence held a central place. It wasn't an enforced absence of sound in the strictest sense, but rather a framework of quiet embedded in both physical space and social custom. The structure of monasteries influenced how monks lived within silence. The cloister, an open courtyard bordered by covered walkways, served as a quiet artery, connecting key buildings: the dormitory, refectory, church, and chapter house. These arched corridors were intentionally designed to dull rather than carry sound. The stone columns and vaulted ceilings absorbed echoes. Footsteps dispersed gently against gravel paths and moss-softened stone. Passing monks often avoided direct eye contact, keeping their heads low, hands folded, communication limited to subtle gestures. Stone was the dominant building material. In the north, granite. In the south, limestone. Walls were thick, windows narrow, and interiors shaded. There was no glass in early centuries, only oiled linen or stretched animal membranes. The air inside remained cool and still. Wind threaded softly through slits in the wall. The absence of insulation meant that nature was never excluded. Rain drummed lightly on roof tiles, and winter's frost clung to corners. Silence was never perfect, but it was rarely pierced. Even thunder, when it came, moved across the sky like distant rolling bells, never sharp, never jarring. Within this setting, designated spaces allowed minimal speech. The chapter house was one such area. Each morning after prime, monks gathered there to hear a portion of the rule read aloud. The abbot would deliver instructions for the day. Replies were rare. Questions rarer still. The vaulted ceilings, curved walls, and circular seating arrangement enhanced clarity of voice while maintaining its subdued quality. If a monk needed to admit a mistake or confess a lapse, it was done in soft tones, not to disturb the atmosphere of restraint. The rhythm of monastic life revolved around the horarium, the schedule of canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each was marked by chanting. These chants, known as plainsong or Gregorian chant, were slow and unembellished, sung in unison without harmony. There were no instruments, no crescendos, only measured syllables intoned in echo-friendly churches. The chants were a sound that preserved silence rather than broke it, like ripples across still water. In the scriptorium, the silence deepened further. Rows of wooden desks lined the room. Quills scraped against vellum, and the scent of ink mixed with wax. The air hung with stillness. Monks used hand signals to communicate, simple, learned signs that replaced everyday words. One gesture might request a knife to trim a quill, another might ask for a different manuscript. These signs varied slightly by order and region, but most were passed down through training. In winter, cloaks were worn even indoors, and hands moved stiffly. Yet the work continued, line after line, letter after letter. The dormitory, often a long chamber with small windows near the ceiling, was its own world of silence. The beds, aligned neatly, were made of wood and straw. Each monk slept fully clothed, often with their belt loosened but not removed. At the sound of the midnight bell, they would rise for matins without speaking. The transition from sleep to prayer involved no murmurs or greetings. Lamps, dimmed low, cast elongated shadows across the walls. Sandals slid, doors creaked faintly, and figures passed one another in wordless procession. The lavatorium, more than just a place for washing, reinforced the culture of nonverbal conduct. A long stone trough, fed by a lead pipe or aqueduct, allowed for communal washing. Water trickled from spouts carved into animal faces or simple arches. Soap was lye-based, often gritty. Washing was a ritual act, scrubbing hands before meals, cleaning feet after labor in the fields. The only sound was the rhythmic flow of water and the damp slap of cloth. In the refectory, silence was paired with reading. Meals were taken communally, with one monk assigned as reader. He stood at a raised pulpit near the door and read aloud from a chosen text scripture, lives of saints, or theological commentary. His voice was calm, steady, and uninterrupted. Other monks ate with downcast eyes. Bowls made of wood, spoons of horn, bread torn, not cut, liquids poured from ceramic jugs. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the meal, all stood, bowed, and exited without delay. In the garden or orchard, where monks worked among rows of vegetables or tended fruit trees, the silence adapted but didn't dissolve. Tools made light contact with earth. Shovels shifted soil, shears trimmed vines, and the wind moved through high hedges. Bees visited flowering herbs. A breeze lifted the scent of rosemary or damp soil. The monks moved slowly, tending tasks without chatter. Even in tasks that might seem solitary, they shared a communal quiet. The infirmary, reserved for those ill or aging, permitted exceptions. Here, speech was allowed when needed, though still minimal. Caregivers spoke gently, often in Latin or vernacular depending on local practice. Herbal remedies, prepared from dried plants grown in the physic garden, were administered without discussion. Beds, spaced far apart, were enclosed by curtains to dampen light and sound. Occasionally, the whisper of a prayer or low groan disturbed the room, but voices never rose in volume. The bell tower, often one of the tallest structures in the complex, offered a predictable intrusion into the day's quiet. Bells rang to signal each hour of prayer, and also marked special events, visits from nobles, deaths within the order, or feast days. Bells were cast from bronze, tuned to resonate without jarring. Each monastery had its own tones. Their sound was not noise, but notification, a sound that was expected, desired even, a call that broke silence but didn't fracture it. Even travel between monastic sites preserved the same quiet. When monks journeyed on foot from one abbey to another, they did so under a vow of silence. They walked along riverbanks or wooded paths, through villages, past marketplaces. Villagers might wave, children might whisper, but the monks stayed mute. If addressed, they responded with a gesture or bowed slightly. The silence extended beyond the walls, becoming part of their identity. Silence, then, was more than abstaining from speech. It was a shared discipline shaped by space, stone, habit, and expectation. The buildings supported it, the community upheld it. It threaded itself into the very fabric of daily action. From the cloister's shadows to the soft scraping in the scriptorium, from the hiss of rain on slate roofs to the low hum of chanting, the world was full of sound, yet quiet remained the prevailing condition. In monasteries like Fountains in Yorkshire or Senanque in Provence, the silence lingers even now. Tourists visit. Feet echo on stone. But the spaces seem to request hush, as if still listening for the rhythm of sandals on flagstone and the rustle of habits brushing cold walls. The design endures. The silence remains not imposed, but embedded. The cell and the self. Solitude behind monastic doors. In the Carthusian monastery of Grande Chartreuse, nestled within the Chartreuse Mountains of southeastern France, the year was 1372. A monk stepped quietly into his cell, the door's ancient iron hinges releasing a low creak that faded into the thick stone walls. The cell was sparse, cool, and dim. Its floor had been swept that morning, though the uneven surface still held small flecks of dust. The narrow window, set high in the wall, was fitted with translucent horn that allowed a dull, golden light to enter. No fire burned. No noise stirred. A bed, a desk, a stool, and a crucifix were all that adorned the space. Yet within those unadorned walls, silence grew thick and layered. Carthusians lived alone, unlike Benedictines or Cistercians who shared dormitories and refectories. Each monk was assigned a cell, though it more closely resembled a miniature house. It contained a study, a sleeping space, a place for prayer, and a tiny enclosed garden. These cells were built in a ring around the cloister, with their doors facing inward. Meals arrived through a wooden turn hatch. The outside monk placed the tray, turned the hatch, and departed. The recipient retrieved the meal without exchange. No greetings, no acknowledgments, not even a glance. Time within the cell moved at a pace undisturbed by distraction. The canonical hours still governed the structure of the day: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and complinibat. In between these, the monk was alone with his tasks and thoughts. Some hours were spent copying texts, others tending to the small vegetable plot. The silence was not stillness alone, but a soundscape of muted activity, a scraping of parchment, the faint rub of woolen sleeves, the breath drawn and exhaled with care. Wooden shelves supported volumes of Latin scripture and patristic commentary. The bindings were stiff, the pages thick with age. The monk read slowly, whispering the words under his breath, sometimes repeating a line several times. The act of reading aloud to oneself was not discouraged. It was seen as a form of interior listening. The words filled the space gently, then fell away. Prayer formed the rhythm between tasks. These were said in solitude. The body knelt on a worn cushion, hands folded in habit. The voice seldom rose above a whisper. Psalms were recited from memory or read in rotation. There was no need to be heard by others. The intent was inward. The ritual was as much physical as it was vocal. The desk bore faint grooves from years of writing. Quills, knives, and inkpots were arranged with care. A page, once begun, might take several hours to complete. Illumination was rare in Carthusian scriptoria, but not unknown. When it occurred, it was modest: an initial letter in red ink, a thin line of gold. Silence here was measured by the slow progress of thought across vellum. In the winter months, frost gathered along the window's edge. A small brazier offered some heat, but its coals were used sparingly. The monk layered his garments and worked through the cold. Breath fogged the air. Candles made of tallow flickered with each small movement. Yet the silence held. It wasn't broken by hardship, only thickened by it. The enclosed garden, though small, was carefully maintained. Herbs such as sage, mint, and hyssop grew along the borders. Occasionally, cabbage or leeks were cultivated in the center beds. A wooden bench stood beneath a stone arch. The garden was not merely for sustenance, but also for motion. A monk might walk slowly along the edges, hands clasped behind his back, eyes lowered. The sounds of bees, rustling leaves, and distant wind were allowed to surface. No words entered. Communication, when necessary, was performed through established gestures. A nod might mean agreement. A hand pressed to the chest could signal gratitude. Writing was permitted only when essential. Letters were short, direct, and rare. Most cells included a grating or narrow window facing an interior corridor, so that limited exchanges could occur unseen. The rule of silence was never absolute, but it remained inviolable in spirit. On Thursdays, the monks walked together in silence beyond the cloister walls. This weekly walk, known as the spatiamentum, offered exercise and change of air. Still, no speech was permitted. The monks walked in pairs, each keeping pace without acknowledging the other. Their route passed through forest paths and along hillsides. The natural world replaced human conversation. Birds, running water, and wind in branches took the place of speech. During times of fasting, especially during Lent and Advent, silence grew denser, the body became lighter. Meals were simple, often broth, a crust of rye bread, or a few boiled roots. The tray arrived as usual, the bell rang once, and the monk received the meal without delay. Hunger, rather than diminishing silence, made it sharper. Every small sound, the spoon against clay, the tearing of bread, the gulp of water, seemed to lengthen in the air. Sickness was dealt with quietly. If a monk fell ill, he remained in his cell. Another monk, designated as infirmarian, would check in once or twice daily. The visit was brief. A warm cloth might be placed on the forehead. Herbs, steeped in water, would be left nearby. If death approached, it did so without spectacle. The monk would remain in bed, breathing slowly, the candle guttering nearby. His last sounds would be his own prayers. Visitors from outside were rare and carefully regulated. If permitted, they would remain in a guest house near the entrance. Communication with monks occurred through screens or grills. These architectural features allowed voices to pass, but not presence. Most Carthusian charter houses designed their reception spaces so that the cloister remained visually and acoustically protected. The passage of time in the cell was not counted in hours, but in patterns. A bell for prime, a pause for sext, a kneel for vespers, a candle lit at dusk, a robe folded in the evening. There were no interruptions, no urgent news, no change of schedule. Even the seasons shifted without commentary. Snow fell in silence, leaves dropped without witness. Rain traced soft lines along the outer walls. Tools were used without announcement. A small hammer for bookbinding, a needle for mending a robe, a whetstone for sharpening a quill. Each object had its place. Each movement produced only what sound was needed. Silence was not about absence, but restraint. Noise was not forbidden, but uninvited. By late evening, the shadows would have deepened. The cell remained unchanged. A monk might kneel once more beside his bed. He would extinguish the candle with his fingers or a small metal snuffer. The room would darken completely. The air would still. The wooden beams would creak once in the cooling air, then quiet. And in that quiet, the cell endured, not as isolation, not as exile, but as space prepared to receive the silence again tomorrow, just as it had the day before. The silent table. Eating without speaking in the monastic world. In the Romanesque dining hall of the Abbey of Saint Benoît-sur-Loire, the long refectory sat beneath heavy timbered beams and arched windows that filtered pale daylight into the stone interior. The benches, lined along either side of two narrow wooden tables, were worn from centuries of use. In the early 14th century, a monk would enter this space not to speak, but to partake in one of the most regulated aspects of monastic life, the silent meal. Conversation was not part of nourishment. Speech was suspended the moment one crossed the threshold. The act of eating became a communal observance of quiet discipline. The Rule of Saint Benedict, composed in the 6th century and followed by numerous monastic communities, prescribed specific guidelines for meals. Silence during dining was not merely a custom, but a command. Each meal was accompanied by a reading. One monk, assigned weekly, stood at a pulpit positioned midway down the wall and read aloud while the others consumed their food in stillness. His voice, slow and deliberate, formed the only permitted sound. He did not pause for reactions or adjust his pace to the rhythm of the spoons. He continued even when the meal ended. The refectory was not just a place to eat, it was a physical structure built to reinforce silence. High ceilings helped diffuse sound. Thick walls suppressed echo. The stone floors were swept each morning, and sand was sometimes scattered to soften the tread of feet. No tapestries adorned the walls to absorb voice, nor were cushions permitted on benches. Each sound was considered in its proper measure. Monks filed into the hall after the midday office. Their entry was single file, hoods raised, eyes lowered. No greetings were exchanged. Each monk took his assigned seat. Dishes were already set. a simple bowl, a wooden spoon, a hunk of bread, and a ceramic mug for watered wine. The food varied slightly depending on the day or season, but it remained modest lentils, porridge, root vegetables. Meat was largely excluded, except for the sick or elderly. The reader began with a short invocation, often a line from Scripture. Then he turned to a selected text, commonly the life of a saint, a passage from the Psalms, or a commentary from an early theologian. His voice, clear but subdued, did not rise in tone or falter with emphasis. He had practiced the reading beforehand, ensuring that even complex Latin constructions would not disturb the pace. Meanwhile, servers, also monks, distributed the meal. They moved along the tables with slow, deliberate steps, placing bowls without clatter. No instructions were spoken. The servers had memorized their duties and responded only to subtle hand gestures or eye movements. A raised eyebrow might indicate an empty cup. A nod might confirm receipt of a second portion. Silence was preserved even in interaction. If a monk needed to communicate during the meal, he did not speak. Instead, he used a system of signs, standardized across many Benedictine houses. A pointed finger might mean salt. A circle drawn in the air could request more bread. These gestures were learned during novitiate, and their use was both encouraged and monitored. Speaking out loud unless in emergency was considered a breach of discipline. Meals were conducted at specific hours. Dinner was taken at midday. Supper was lighter and served at dusk during certain seasons. During Lent, only one meal might be provided, taken in the afternoon. The timing changed with the liturgical calendar and local practice, but the rules of silence remained constant. Even feast days, while more generous with portions, maintained the ban on conversation. Once the food was served, monks began to eat together. There was no prayer at the table itself, as this was said before entering the refectory. Eating was methodical. Each movement from lifting the spoon to tearing the bread was performed with care. Chewing was slow, swallowing unhurried. No utensil struck the bowl noisily, no hand reached suddenly. The soundscape was filled with soft rustles, faint clinks, and the measured breath of men seated in rows. The reader did not look up while reading. He continued through the text at a uniform pace. Occasionally, a passage might stir memory or emotion in a listener, but no response was visible. Each monk maintained composure. Emotion, if felt, was internalized. It was not shared, not spoken, not written down afterward. The reading was absorbed like light through horn-panned windows, dimly, steadily. At the end of the meal, a bell was struck. All monks rose slowly. The reader ceased his reading without commentary and returned to his seat. A short prayer was said by the prior or appointed monk, quietly and with bowed head. Then the brothers filed out in the same order they had entered. Dishes were taken to the scullery without words. Scraping plates and rinsing bowls occurred under the same vow of quiet. The scullery, often attached to the west end of the refectory, was where silence met manual labor. A brother assigned to this task worked alone or with one partner. Buckets were filled and emptied, scrub brushes worn down, the splash of water, the scrape of bowl, the sound of clay against stone. These were the natural voices of the place. No one remarked on the work. It was done, like everything else, within the rhythm of the hours. In some monasteries, particularly Cluniac houses, meals were slightly more elaborate, but the silence remained. Even when courses included fish, cheese, or preserved fruit, the etiquette did not change. Eyes focused on the plate, movements remained deliberate. If a utensil fell to the ground, it was retrieved without a word. If spilled wine darkened a robe, no comment was made. Cleanliness followed silence. Monks were expected to fast from speech as they fasted from food. This dual abstinence created a space where the act of eating became both nourishment and obedience. Silence served not only as a method of discipline, but also of unity. Every monk participated equally. No voice rose above another. No discussion invited disagreement. The body was sustained in tandem with the soul, both under the same rules. On rare occasions, such as the visit of a bishop or high-ranking guest, the rule might be relaxed. Even then, conversation was limited to the guest and the abbot, conducted away from the general table. The refectory itself remained governed by the same principles. The visiting cleric would often eat in a separate hall, while the monks continued their practice without adjustment. By evening, the refectory stood empty again. Benches were wiped, tables left bare. A single candle might burn in the reading pulpit for a few moments longer, then be snuffed out. The room returned to its original quiet. Footsteps moved away across stone corridors. No laughter echoed, no voices lingered. Only the memory of the day's reading remained, carried silently into the night. And thus, the table remained a place, not of talk, but of quiet sustenance, where meals were taken not in speech, but in silence shaped by centuries of devotion. The guest without a voice. Silence in the monastic hospice. In the year 1181, a traveler arrived at the Abbey of Cluny just before dusk. His horse, fatigued from the long ride through the Saône Valley, was handed over to a lay brother. No questions were asked. The man was shown to a side building near the outer wall, constructed of timber and stone. It was the guest house, reserved for those arriving from the world beyond the cloister. Though welcome was extended, it came without chatter. The monks did not greet with speech. They received him in silence. Hospitality was a sacred obligation. Monasteries offered shelter to pilgrims, nobles, peasants, and at times, even the excommunicated. The Rule of Saint Benedict devoted an entire chapter to the care of guests, stating that all were to be received as Christ himself. Yet this welcome, though deeply sincere, was given without the usual trappings of human interaction. Monastic silence extended into the reception, lodging, and feeding of those who came. Upon entering the guest house, the visitor found a simple chamber with a wooden bed, a small table, and a basin of water. No one explained its use. A lamp burned low in a wall niche. Bread and cheese rested beneath a cloth. A pitcher of watered wine stood beside it. No note was left. The room said everything it needed to say. The guest, uncertain at first, followed the example laid before him. He remained quiet. Guests were separated from the monastic enclosure. The cloister itself was not accessible. An outer gate led to the guest quarters and the chapel designated for visitors. Some abbeys had a guest refectory. Others provided meals in the private chamber. In both cases, the brothers attending did not speak unless required. Meals were served with gentle nods. Questions were answered with gestures. The absence of speech created an atmosphere unfamiliar to most travelers. Many came weary and full of words. They left subdued. The porter, often the first monk encountered, had a unique role. Stationed near the entrance, he was permitted to speak to guests briefly, with restraint. He offered only what was necessary: confirmation of lodging, directions to the chapel, mention of times for meals. His tone remained even. There were no personal inquiries, no idle conversation. His task was to act as a boundary, not a guide. At dawn, bells from within the abbey told the beginning of the offices. Guests heard them from their quarters. While not obliged to attend, many visited the guest chapel to witness the monastic rhythm. There, the same silence held sway. Chanting emerged from the main church, faint but clear. The guest chapel contained no sermon, no extemporaneous prayer. It was not a space for emotional expression. It offered structure, stillness, repetition. Those who required medical attention were directed to the guest infirmary, a small wing adjoining the outer garden. Here, the silence took on a different tone. The monk assigned to care for guests communicated sparingly. Herbal compresses, broths, and tinctures were prepared with attention. A gesture to lie down, a hand extended with a cup. Recovery unfolded quietly. The sounds of the sick coughs, sighs, restless turning were not answered with speech. They were acknowledged, but not echoed. For wealthier visitors, separate rooms were sometimes provided, outfitted with finer bedding and heavier blankets. Yet even in these more comfortable spaces, the customs did not change. A nobleman from Poitiers or a merchant from Lyon would find no valet to question him, no brother to recount news. The silence was impartial. All were subject to it. Visitors unfamiliar with monastic practice often attempted conversation. A traveling cleric might ask a question. A knight might attempt a jest. The monk would respond with a slight bow or raise of the hand. The message was clear. This was not the place for dialogue. Words were measured not in quantity, but in necessity. Some travelers left offerings, coins, books, lengths of cloth. These were placed in designated baskets or boxes. The gesture was observed but never acknowledged aloud. Gratitude was assumed. Praise was unnecessary. A monk might glance toward the donor or incline his head, but no thanks were spoken. Generosity, like everything else, was met with silence. Occasionally, a monk served as interpreter for guests unfamiliar with Latin or the local tongue. Even then, the exchange was brief. There were no debates, no storytelling, only function. A question asked, an answer provided. The conversation, if it could be called that, was minimal. Evening in the guest house came early. Lamps were trimmed, doors latched. The sounds of prayer drifted faintly through the walls. The guest lay down with few distractions. Outside, wind pressed against shutters. Inside, stillness enveloped the chamber. No footsteps echoed in the hall, no voices passed in the night. When monks brought meals, they did so efficiently. A knock on the door, a tray placed gently, a nod exchanged. Then departure. The food was modest. Pottage, a hunk of rye bread, perhaps dried figs, nothing lavish. Yet every item was arranged with care. The guest might notice the even cut of the bread or the clean cloth beneath the bowl. These small details served as silent hospitality. The following morning, departure required no formal farewell. The guest rose with the light, gathered his belongings, and left the key on the table. The porter might nod once more. A gate would open. The traveler stepped back into the wider world. No blessing was pronounced, no farewell uttered, but something had been given nonetheless. Monastic silence was not imposed on guests with force. It was offered as an invitation. Most accepted it after a few hours. Some resisted it throughout their stay. Regardless, the rule remained. The monastery did not bend. The voice of the world was left at the gate. In times of crisis, famine, conflict, plague, the guest house became crowded. Refugees, displaced families, and the wounded sought entry. Monks adjusted as needed. Spaces were divided. Supplies were stretched. Yet the silence remained. Even among the groans and weeping, the brothers moved without clamor. The rule held fast. Children, when present, posed a challenge. Their natural inclination to speak and question tested the stillness. But they too adapted. A child, placed in a quiet room, soon grew hushed. A boy given bread without lecture simply ate. A girl watching a monk light a lamp asked nothing. She learned, as others had, through watching. Writers from the period remarked on this aspect of monastic life. The traveler Ibn Jubayr noted the stillness he encountered. Abbot Peter the Venerable described the guest house as a place where souls could breathe, undisturbed by the noise of daily ambition. The silence left an impression, not easily forgotten. And so the guest house stood, not merely as a shelter, but as an extension of the monastic vow, a place where welcome required no conversation, where care was rendered without commentary, where the absence of speech became its own kind of presence. What remained unspoken lingered longest. The learning without words, how novices were trained in silence. In the Abbey of Saint Victor outside the gates of Paris, during the year 1156, a young novice entered the cloister for the first time. He did not speak as he passed beneath the arched entrance. His woolen habit hung awkwardly from his thin frame. The sandals were slightly too large. He carried no book, no belongings, only the awareness that he had stepped into a place where sound obeyed different rules. An older monk waited in the passageway, did not extend a hand, did not smile, but turned and began walking. The novice followed. Training in silence did not begin with explanation. There was no formal orientation. New entrants learned by shadowing the seasoned. The absence of speech was not just a condition, it was the curriculum. Every lesson was observed, never recited. Eyes replaced ears. Gestures stood in place of instructions. Knowledge was passed from body to body, not voice to voice. The novice's day began early. At the ringing of the bell, he rose from a straw mattress, folded his blanket, and walked toward the chapel. The others walked in rhythm. No corrections were given for missteps. If he strayed from the line, he was expected to notice. The procession continued, with or without him. In the choir stalls, he stood behind his mentor, listening as the chants began. He did not sing yet. His mouth remained closed. Learning the order of psalms, the shape of melodies, and the pacing of breath required patience. The refectory was another classroom. Entering in silence, he sat at the lower end of the table. When food was placed before him, he waited. He learned to observe the timing, when to raise the spoon, when to fold his hands. A monk read from a raised lectern. The Latin was measured. The rhythm did not break, even when the novice struggled to follow. No one leaned over to whisper guidance. The silence taught him to look closely, to adjust quietly. In the garden, he was given a small tula spade or knife hand, assigned to a section of soil. The older monks tended herbs or vegetables in orderly rows. He watched their movements, how they cleared stones, loosened roots, watered seedlings. No voices called across rows. No one demonstrated. He imitated slowly, making errors that were acknowledged with a glance, a pause, a returned motion. The rhythm of labor embedded instruction. Copying scripture began later. First, he practiced lettering on scraps of parchment. He sat near others, but not beside a teacher. Mistakes were scraped off with a blade. Pages were examined at the end of the day. Corrections, when necessary, were indicated with small symbols or repositioned sheets. No comments were delivered. Improvement came by repetition, not by critique. Every part of monastic life became part of the novice's silent education. He watched the way robes were folded, candles trimmed, doors opened and closed. He learned the hand signs for requesting water, bread, or a writing tool. Each gesture had a place. Each response had a meaning. They were practiced as surely as language, but without syllables. The most difficult part was internal. Thought could not be voiced. Confusion was not resolved aloud. Instead, the novice had to hold the question until the weekly chapter meeting, the only time speech was permitted. There, he could raise a hand and ask, in front of all, something essential. Responses were short, then silence resumed. Older monks did not interrupt the learning process. They allowed the novice to fumble. A missed genuflection, a late arrival, a dropped spoon known were corrected in the moment. The environment itself provided instruction. The novice adapted to its stillness. Awareness replaced command. Memory replaced reminders. In the dormitory, he lay in his own bed, but heard the rustling of others rising for matins. The candlelight flickered across vaulted ceilings. No one called him by name. He was not summoned. If he did not wake, he missed the office. No one came for him. The rhythm of the day waited for no one. Gradually, his body learned the pattern. His first chant came during compline. After weeks of listening, his mentor nodded slightly. He joined a single line of the psalm. His voice was quiet, uncertain. No one commented afterward. He did not know if he had done well. He only knew that he had been permitted to join. Permission was never spoken. It was offered through time. When illness came, the novice did not ask for help. A brother noticed. A basin of warm water appeared. A simple meal was placed by his mat. No words acknowledged the gesture. He understood that care did not require noise. Gratitude, too, remained unspoken. In the library, he was allowed to touch bound volumes only after learning how to turn the page. He stood and watched as another monk leafed through parchment without bending the spine. Then he was given a worn text. He traced the lines with his finger. No one explained the content. Understanding grew slowly, in quiet moments, without question or reply. Sundays permitted a short walk in pairs, still without conversation. Two monks walked side by side through the outer garden or along the cloister walk. The novice walked with his mentor. They did not exchange ideas. They shared pace. The silence was not emptiness. It became companionship without demand. After a year, the novice took part in his first full office, chanting with the others from start to finish. No signal marked the moment. He simply joined. No congratulations followed. The bell rang, and all filed out. He now moved with them, not behind. At profession, the vow of silence was not taken lightly. It had already shaped him. He no longer waited for instruction. He had learned to receive knowledge from presence, not from sound. The community accepted him not through words, but through the absence of them. In the abbey, time moved without urgency. The novice became monk through accretion, not initiation. Every footstep across stone floors, every breath held in chapel, every task done without remark, these built his understanding. The silence, once strange, became familiar. He no longer feared it. It was not a void, but a teacher. It showed him when to act, how to wait, where to look. And in that quiet instruction, he had found something he had not known to seek. No applause, no ceremony. The novice, no longer new, stood in the line of monks, indistinguishable from the rest. The soundless hours, what monks did after dark. In the winter of 1179, at the Abbey of Rieux in the north of England, night fell with certainty. By the time the bell called the monks to vespers, the sun had already vanished behind the hills. A light frost clung to the roof tiles, and the windows no longer offered a view, only the flickering reflections of tallow candles. Inside, the monks made their way through the long corridors without a word. Their habits brushed softly against the stone walls. Sandals met cold stone without haste. No one spoke. The silence deepened, as though the entire abbey inhaled and then held its breath. After vespers, there was little movement. Some monks returned to their dormitory. Others knelt alone in the church for quiet prayer. Then came Compline, the final office of the day. Once complete, the great silence began. This silence was more than the absence of conversation. It was a deliberate withdrawal from sound. It applied to all. From that moment until morning, not a single word would be spoken. The dormitory was simple and long, with wooden beams above and stone below. Narrow windows faced the inner courtyard. Each monk had a low bed, a coarse blanket, and a wooden chest. Some beds were separated by modest partitions. Others stood in tidy rows. A single oil lamp burned at one end of the room, casting pale shadows that stretched along the walls like arms reaching toward quiet. Monks undressed without urgency. Tunics were folded. Belts were placed neatly at the bedside. Boots were aligned with precision. All movement was intentional. No item was dropped. No gesture was rushed. There were no evening conversations, no whispered thoughts. A monk might glance at another, but only briefly. It was not a time for recognition. It was a time for withdrawal. Each monk prayed silently before lying down. Some sat at the edge of their bed, hands folded around a small psalter. Others lay on their backs, eyes open to the rafters. Still others knelt beside their beds, with heads bowed. No words were exchanged, no good nights, no murmured confessions. The final candle was extinguished. The room became still. The sound of breathing filled the space, the only rhythm remaining. Even in sleep, the silence held. No monk snored without notice. Those who stirred did so gently. A cough echoed once, and then faded into the beams. The rafters groaned under the weight of winter. The wind threaded through the narrow window gaps. But no voices responded. The quiet remained intact. It was a silence both chosen and endured. Matins came before sunrise. In the coldest months, it arrived while stars still filled the sky, and frost turned the cloister stones pale. A bell rang not loudly, just once. The monks stirred. One by one, they rose, dressed, and filed into line. The path to the church was not lit, no torches. Their steps were guided by memory and faith. Inside the church, the air was colder than in the dormitory. Stone walls held the chill. The monks took their places in the choir stalls, hands hidden in sleeves. No greetings, no gestures. The signal came. Chant began. The melodies were quiet, slow, unadorned. The psalms chosen for this hour were the most solemn. They spoke of waiting, of sorrow, of death and mercy. Between verses, there were long pauses. These silences were not errors. They were part of the liturgy. They were part of the hour. No one shifted, no one adjusted. The silence framed the sound like the dark frames the stars. When a reading followed, it was spoken in a low, flat voice. Each word deliberate, each phrase received, not dissected. The meaning was never explained. It was lived. After matins, some monks returned to their beds. Others remained in the church for prayer. A few stayed seated in their cells. They did not read. They did not write. They did not move. They waited. For what, they would not say. But the waiting was its own practice. The rule of silence extended across the entire abbey. The kitchen remained unlit. No fire crackled. The scriptorium was locked. The gardens lay untouched under frost. Nothing stirred. If a monk tended an animal, he did so in silence. A lantern might glow, but it cast no warmth. The world outside did not know the abbey had awoken. Novices found the nights hardest. The stillness pressed on them like weight. The desire to speak rose like breath held too long. But in time, even they grew quiet. They learned to listen to footsteps, to the rustling of habits, to the wind against the stone, to the subtle hush of breath. They learned to rest without sound. Some monks did not sleep deeply. Their bodies rested, but their minds kept watch. They were not afraid of the dark. They had lived too long beside it. For them, the silence was not an absence. It was a shelter. A monk might lie awake, eyes tracing the ceiling beams, hearing the slow tick of night pass overhead. And when dawn edged in, he would rise without question. The abbey's rhythm did not stop in winter, though it softened. Blankets thickened. Cloaks stayed on. Basins froze. Breath became visible. Yet even in discomfort, no one complained. There were no requests for warmth. No exchanges of sympathy. The discomfort was part of the order. One monk was always assigned to keep watch. He sat in a stone alcove of the cloister, a small lamp beside him. He did not patrol. He did not write. He waited. If he saw a light, he noted it. If he heard a sound, he listened. He did not seek to fix or question. His role was not intervention. It was quiet witness. In rare moments, a monk would rise before the bell. Perhaps he dreamt of his old life. Perhaps his bones ached. He would walk the corridor slowly, hands folded, sandals whispering on the stone. He would not knock on doors. He would not ask questions. He would return to his bed when ready. The silence allowed him space without explanation. If a monk passed during the night, the community did not know until morning. His cot remained untouched, his breathless stillness undisturbed. At the bell, a brother checked. A sign was made. No words spoken. The rhythm did not break. Rituals waited until louds. Death entered quietly, as silence permitted. Silence shaped the night. It was not merely a rule, it was a presence. The monks did not speak because there was nothing that needed to be said. Each sound had weight. Each breath mattered. Each pause became a form of understanding. The night did not require commentary. As morning neared, the tones of the world changed. A crow called from the trees. The wind no longer howled, it sighed. The cold softened. The sky lightened. The monks stirred again. No bell urged them. Their bodies remembered. And so they rose, pulled on cloaks, and stepped into place. No words broke the hush. The new day began not with declarations, but with movement. In the quiet halls of Rievaulx, silence remained their first companion and their truest discipline. After lauds, the spoken word returned sparingly. Instructions for the day were brief and only permitted in specific places. In the chapter house, the prior gave readings. In the refectory, the lector read aloud as the brothers ate in silence. The speech that was allowed had form and structure measured, liturgical, necessary. The monks entered the daylight as if emerging from a deeper layer of time. Tasks resumed. Cloisters filled with the sound of work, not talk racks across stone, buckets drawn from wells, pages turned in the scriptorium. But the residue of the night's silence lingered. It shaped how they moved, how they listened, how they inhabited the day. Silence was not only for the dark, it was the breath between tasks, the pause before reply, the reverence beneath every action. What monks did after dark was not so different from what they did in the light. They waited, they watched, and they listened. And when the sun sank again behind the hills, and the bell once more called them to vespers, the monks returned, not to stillness but to a silence that had never truly left. The unspoken routine, monks and the language of order. At the Abbey of Rievaulx, daily life unfolded not in stories or conversations, but in gestures, routines, and rhythms that asked for no reply. From the rising of the sun to the fading of daylight, the monks moved through a schedule that was as strict as it was silent. The rule of St. Benedict shaped each hour. Not just a guideline, but a framework that guided their steps, their tasks, and their breath. After the silence of night and the early return of speech at lauds, monks did not burst into conversation. They returned to duties already known to them, carried out in quiet, predictable succession. The same work, the same route, the same tone. Their obedience was not only to their superiors, but to time itself. The bell marked every shift and activity. When it rang, they knew whether to pray, to eat, to labor, or to pause. No verbal instructions were needed, no announcements. One bell for prime, one for terce, one for sext and nones, each tone slightly different, each hour fixed by tradition and memory. At prime, shortly after sunrise, the monks gathered in the church again. They chanted the appointed psalms, stood and bowed as instructed, and exited in silence. This was not a time to reflect personally. It was a time to participate as a body, to stand where others had stood, to echo the same lines in the same tones at the same point in the day. From there, the monks moved to their assignments. These were rarely changed. A brother assigned to the library would remain there, copying manuscripts, preserving texts. His quills scratched across vellum in the same corner, on the same stool, with the same tools. His work was solitary but shared in purpose. Across the cloister, another monk worked in the herb garden. He harvested thyme and sage, tended to fennel, and made note of which plants had withered in the frost. Still others performed hidden duties. One monk cleaned the latrines with buckets of water and ash. Another scrubbed the cloister walkways, brushing away dirt with a handmade broom. A novice might be tasked with gathering firewood from the outer boundary. He did not report his progress aloud. He returned when done, and his absence was neither questioned nor remarked upon. If a task required instruction, it was delivered through gesture or brief written notes. A tilt of the head, a pointed finger, a hand to the chest, these formed the grammar of daily labor. Older monks needed fewer signs. Their lives were already shaped by repetition. A glance at a tool, the sound of footsteps, even the length of a pause communicated enough. Work continued until terce, the third hour of the day. Again the bell called them. Again they assembled in the church. Psalms were chanted. The readings reminded them of patience, humility, and endurance. After the prayers, some monks returned to work. The chapter house was one of the few places where speech was allowed, but even there, it was brief and directed. The abbot spoke. The monks listened. If discipline was required, it was administered quietly. A monk who had broken a rule might prostrate himself before the group, No words of apology were needed. The act alone said enough. The abbot might assign a penance, the community would nod. Then silence resumed. On some days, monks were called individually to speak to the prior. These meetings were not conversations in the modern sense. A monk might report illness or inability to complete a task. The prior responded with quiet instructions. No arguments were made. The goal was clarity, not exchange. As the sun climbed higher, the monks ate. At midday, the bell for sext sounded. They entered the refectory 2 by 2. Before each meal, a prayer was chanted. Then they sat and began to eat. The lector stood at the pulpit and read aloud. His voice was calm, slow, and unwavering. The reading might be from the Bible, the Rule of St. Benedict, or the Life of a Saint. Whatever the text, the monks did not respond. They listened as they chewed, hands steady, eyes forward. Food was simple: lentils, bread, sometimes fish. The portions were small. If a utensil dropped, it was left on the floor until the end. If a monk needed water, he waited. Meals were not social occasions, they were acts of necessity, carried out with attention and restraint. After the meal, each monk washed his bowl and cup. This task, too, was done in silence. Then they returned to work. Some wrote, some tilled the garden, some spun wool. Others cared for the infirm. Each action was part of a larger harmony. Even mistakes were absorbed into the rhythm. The bell for nones rang in the late afternoon. Again they gathered. Again they prayed. The shadows in the church stretched longer. The candles burned lower. Psalms spoke of endurance and the waning of life. Following nones, monks had a final stretch of time for labor or quiet reflection. They did not wander aimlessly. Each monk knew his space. One sat in the scriptorium, reading a psalter. Another sat beneath a bare tree in the cloister walk. Another remained in the garden, holding a twig between his fingers, watching the light pass through it. Speech did not return, even when permitted. Silence had become their medium. They did not merely live with it, they lived inside it. It filled the space between steps, the corners of rooms, the folds of their habits. At Vespers, the community gathered again. The chant rose and fell with the day's closing light. Psalms spoke of gratitude, reflection, and nightfall. Each monk moved in sync with the others. A slight delay would be noticed. A wrong note heard by all. Yet no correction was made aloud. The group adjusted, gently, as one. After Vespers came the light evening meal. Then a final moment in the cloister, where monks might walk beneath the cold sky. Stars appeared, wind shifted in the hedges, footsteps moved in pairs or alone. Still, no words were spoken. Compline ended the day. The great silence returned. Monks bowed their heads, extinguished candles, and retired to bed. The same rhythm would follow in the morning. In this routine, there was little change. Illness might come, a guest might arrive, a roof tile might crack in the wind. But the routine held firm. It cradled each monk like stone cradles, moss-steady, slow, and without commentary. The silence they kept was not blank, it was full. Each hour offered something to be received: a breath, a line of chant, a touch of sunlight. These were the monk's language. In silence, they found not emptiness, but order. In repetition, they found peace. In each measured step, the world was quiet enough to hear itself think. And so they continued, day after day, in wordless discipline. In the Abbey of Rievaux, no voices named the passing time, yet each hour spoke all the same. The silent tongue, monastic gestures, and the language of signs. In a world without speech, the monks of Rievaux Abbey did not suffer from confusion. They understood each other not by voice, but by the language of movement, quiet signs made by hand, eye, and posture. The rule of St. Benedict made clear when silence was to be kept. But in the spaces where necessity required exchange, a different language emerged. It was not taught from books. It was learned by watching, remembering, and doing. This sign language, though never codified as a universal script, was understood among the brothers. It was practical, born from need. If a monk wanted bread, he mimed the shape of a loaf with both hands. If he wanted salt, he mimed pinching grains. To signal water, he traced a wave through the air. These gestures were simple, clear, and always subdued. Nothing was dramatic. No gesture was large or expressive. Every movement remained within the same quiet character of monastic life. A novice would spend months learning when to make a sign, how long to hold it, and what expression to wear on his face. A raised brow was not neutral, it was interruption. A smile, too wide, was seen as vanity. Even signs had to reflect humility. Communication began at dawn. After the great silence lifted, gestures still replaced most speech. In the refectory, a monk who lacked a spoon might raise one hand and draw the shape of the utensil in the air. Another monk, seeing the request, would nod slightly and pass it along. No thanks would be given aloud. The exchange was complete in the act itself. Gestures became so familiar that speech seemed excessive. If a monk pointed to a cloak, others knew he meant rain. If he touched his shoulder, he meant pain. If he tapped his lips, and then the air, he referred to prayer. There was no need to explain further. Each brother, immersed in the same order and daily structure, knew what the other meant before the gesture finished. When mistakes were made, they were corrected silently. A monk might signal no with a soft shake of the head or a hand gently pushed outward. There were no sharp corrections, no rebukes. If a novice gestured too quickly or too forcefully, an elder would respond with a slower, more controlled version, an example, not a reprimand. During meals, the lector continued reading. The others, though eating, still relied on signs. If a brother needed more bread, he might place 2 fingers together and press them into his palm. If he was too cold, he would hug his shoulders briefly. If he had finished, he would lay his spoon across his bowl and glance toward the server. All of this occurred without a sound. The system worked because it was part of everything. Monks knew when work began, when it ended, when to gather, and when to part, not from being told, but from habit, bells, and subtle movement. If a monk stood in a doorway with his hands folded, others knew to follow. If he opened the gate to the field and looked back once, the meaning was clear: proceed. Signs were not just about tasks, they conveyed care. When a brother was ill and could not join the others, a monk might stop at his door, press his hand to his heart, and continue on. The ill brother would see this through his curtain and understand he was not forgotten. When a monk passed away, the others did not speak of him in words. They folded his habit, lit a lamp beside his cot, and placed a palm branch across the bed. Each act was a sentence. During worship, signs helped maintain unity. If a monk began the wrong chant, the cantor made a small motion, 2 fingers, circled once. If someone stood too soon, the prior held up his palm. In the pauses between psalms, monks adjusted their posture or pointed toward the next page. No one needed to ask aloud. They moved together, cued by breath and glance. Even outside, when labor required greater coordination, words were still absent. In the fields, a lifted hoe meant pause. A hand across the brow meant sun in my eyes. 2 fingers to the lips meant take water. When laying stones or tending animals, monks relied on shared rhythm. If a task was too difficult, a brother simply paused. The gestures, while functional, became a culture of their own. They reflected the values of monastic life: discipline, patience, restraint. No monk made a sign out of turn. No one demanded attention. Every communication was shaped by consideration. Visitors to the abbey often struggled to understand. Pilgrims who arrived seeking aid or prayer were met by a porter who alone had permission to speak. He would receive them with a bow, offer food or water, and return to silence once the guest was settled. Inside, the visitor might observe an entire day pass with no conversation, only glances and gestures. To them, it seemed like a world held together by invisible threads. Monks knew better. The threads were real. The gestures were not decoration, they were structure. A language shaped by silence. A vocabulary of the necessary. Some signs were passed from monastery to monastery, though not always identically. A brother from Fountains Abbey might understand the sign for book, but not the sign for penance. Even so, when monks traveled, they adapted. A slow exchange of hands and eyes often led to shared understanding. In times of illness or crisis, gestures became even more important. If a monk collapsed, another would touch 2 fingers to his lips, then to the floor call for help. If fire broke out, a raised arm circling overhead signaled danger. If someone passed into death, the cross was drawn once in the air, slow and solemn. Over time, older monks taught younger ones not through lectures, but by living example. A novice learned how to request ink by watching an elder mime the bottle. He learned how to ask for forgiveness by kneeling and folding his hands, head low. There were no examinations, no written guides, only repetition and patience. This language of signs endured because it did not rely on memory alone. It lived in practice, in the act of doing, in knowing what came next because it had come before. The abbey's silence was not empty. It was filled with signs. Not in the way cities are filled with voices, but in the way forests are filled with wind, constant, soft, and shaping. At the end of each day, when Compline ended and monks returned to their beds, no one said good night. A glance, a folded hand, a small bow, these were farewells enough. The gestures disappeared into the darkness, as natural as breath. Even in sleep, the language remained. A monk who stirred might press a hand to his chest dreams. One who rose before dawn moved slowly so as not to signal alarm. The night continued, quiet and understood, and in that quiet, monks found not silence but connection. The resting hours, sleep and the nighttime routine of silent monks. In monasteries like Riavaux, even rest followed a rule. Sleep was not an escape from the day's silence. It was a part of it. The hours between Compline and Matins were shaped by the same care and quiet that guided the monk's waking life. In those long, dark hours, they did not speak, did not stir more than necessary, and did not allow the stillness to break. Compline was the last prayer of the day. After it ended, the great silence began. From that moment until the end of morning lauds, no monk was to speak a word. Exceptions were made only for emergencies. Even then, the voice was kept low. Every monk knew that silence was not just a rule. It was a discipline, a gift, and at night, it settled across the abbey like a cloak. The dormitory was a long hall, high-roofed and windowed on one side. Beds were arranged in even rows. Some were separated by low partitions, others stood open. The bedding was simple. A straw mattress, a coarse blanket, a wooden chest at the foot. Each monk had what he needed, nothing more. They entered the dormitory slowly, in line. The lamps along the walls gave a low glow. Some monks removed their habits and folded them neatly. Others wore a lighter tunic for sleep. No one rushed. No one paused to chat. There were no whispered good nights. Only movements, slow, practiced, deliberate. Before bed, many monks knelt at their cots for silent prayer. Heads bowed, hands folded, the room filled with stillness, like a breath held long and deep. Some remained kneeling for a long time. Others lay down quietly, eyes to the ceiling, thoughts moving slowly through remembered psalms. There was no fixed bedtime, but most monks were in bed shortly after Compline. The days were long, the work was physical, sleep came easily, the dormitory grew quiet. A few creaks of the beams, the soft rustle of blankets, the distant wind against the stone walls, these were the only sounds. There were no clocks. Time passed unnoticed until the bell rang again. In winter, the night stretched long. In summer, it came and went swiftly. But always, the rhythm returned. Night fell. Silence deepened, and the abbey became still. Some monks struggled to sleep, not from worry or noise, but from the effort to remain inwardly focused. They lay in bed, their bodies still, their minds repeating familiar prayers. The Our Father, The Psalms. A single line repeated again and again. I will lie down and sleep in peace. This helped them rest, not by forgetting the day, but by folding it into the night. The dormitory was not without supervision. A senior monk sometimes the prior made quiet rounds. He did not speak. He walked the rows, checking for illness or restlessness. If he noticed something unusual, he noted it. But he did not intervene unless needed. His presence was a form of protection, not a guard, but a guide. If a monk awoke in the night, he remained still. Turning too loudly or moving too quickly would disturb others. If he needed to rise, whether to pray, to relieve himself, or to fetch something from his chest, did so with care. Sandals were soft. Doors creaked only if pushed without attention. Every act was quieted by habit. Sometimes a monk chose to wake before matins. These were the light sleepers, or those drawn to vigil. They would rise, dress, and walk to the church in the dark. There, a lamp flickered. A cushion waited, and the silence welcomed them. They prayed alone, surrounded by the absence of all noise. The stillness in the church felt older than the walls. Monks who suffered nightmares or illness were not left alone. If a brother stirred too often, or sat upright in distress, the monk in the next bed might touch his arm gently. No words were exchanged. The touch was enough, a reminder. You are not alone. The great silence allowed for this. It was not a silence of isolation. It was a silence of presence. Everyone knew they shared it. Everyone guarded it. If death came in the night, it was met with the same stillness. A monk who passed in his sleep was not discovered with panic. At matins, when the others rose, his stillness would remain. A senior monk would check, kneel, and bow his head. There would be no alarm, only prayer. The body was washed and dressed in the same habit he wore in life. The silence was not broken. It carried him. The nighttime routine was shaped not only by rules, but by space. The dormitory's high ceilings allowed air to circulate. The thick stone walls held heat in winter and coolness in summer. Windows remained closed in cold months, open in warm ones. The rhythm of breath and sleep was shared. If a monk stirred, others heard it, not clearly, but enough to know that rest was still a communal act. The youngest monks learned quickly. At first, they shifted too often, knocked a bench, breathed too loudly, but they watched, they followed. Over time, their movements slowed. They breathed in rhythm with the others. Their rest became quiet. The night had its own pulse, not measured in hours or dreams, but in the smooth return to stillness after each motion. A cough, a turn, a pause. Then, quiet again. The abbey breathed. Then the bell rang. Soft at first. Then again. Matins. Monks rose in the dark. They did not speak. They dressed quickly. Hands moved by memory. Belts tied, sandals found, hoods pulled up. They left their beds as they had entered them without a word. The line formed. Lamps were lifted. The walk to the church began. Through the cloister, under the stars, across the stone path slick with dew. The doors opened. The chant began. The silence did not end. It changed shape. From the stillness of sleep to the stillness of song. The voices rose together, not loud, not fast, just present. The resting hours were over, but the quiet remained, and so the monks continued. From night into morning, from stillness into motion, from silence into prayer. The sleep of a monk was not just rest. It was part of the rhythm that made up the whole. It prepared the mind. It softened the body. It trained the heart. So when the day began again, the monks were not waking from silence. They were waking within it. The bells have stopped. The lamps are out. The cloisters are empty once again. And still, the silence remains pressed into stone, folded into robes, echoing softly through the centuries. What the monks left behind wasn't just parchment or chant or quiet corridors. It was a rhythm, a way of being, a kind of peace that asked for nothing but attention. If you've made it this far, quietly, patiently, and without hurry, thank you. If you'd like more stories told slowly, Gently and with care, you can subscribe. Or not. That part, like everything here, is quiet and entirely up to you. Sleep well, stay curious, and may silence find you wherever you are.